Hi there, this is G, and welcome back to the third part in my Source Direct Breakdown series. Now today I'm going to be walking through my entire process of taking a raw amen break all the way to the finished one I used in my track I recently uploaded to this channel. Now, when we look at secret liaisons in particular, the amen break processing there by Source Direct is really incredible, and the tone and the dynamics they've achieved with the really wacky snare, and it's just a really great sounding break. And so I've gone through quite a process to get my break to sound as much like theirs as I possibly can. Now I think a really good place to start here is actually to show you some references just so you can really hear what's going on and how different these breaks are going to sound. So what I've got here is an amen break, and I haven't processed it at all, but I have sped it up to 174. And then I've also got the secret liaison break, so we can hear these two compared against each other now. So we can clearly hear there the kicks are a lot punchier and weightier, the snare's really whacking, it's a lot brighter and less muddy, and it's just a cleaner, faster sounding break. So they've gone through quite a process there to warp the original break to really work in their track and to sound just better in almost every way. Another really useful example I've got here is 3 different amens by Source Direct, and also this one by Dillinger, just to show you how this one break, all the different ways these artists are manipulating the break and processing it differently to work with their tracks. And then the final reference I want to show you is the original amen break versus the secret liaison one versus my finished one I bounced on my final project. Just so you can hear where we've come from, where we're trying to get to, and kind of how we did and how close I got with my own processing. I think it might be very useful to quickly highlight some of the actual main goals we're trying to achieve through this break processing. And sometimes it's about cleaning up the breaks and removing unnecessary mud and making them cleaner and brighter and more precise. And then other times it's about making them more crunchy and fat and dirty and saturated. And I think one other thing we're trying to do is potentially improve the transient response and make them more punchy. But there's always a balance of all these factors and then achieving like a loud, good sounding break in the final mix. And so you've always got to balance all of these things together to really achieve good sounding breaks. Now I think it's really worth me explaining what I actually mean about loudness and fatness of the break. And this is really about improving the peak to body ratio of the drum hits in the break. And to do this, we're going to use saturation and compression and clipping and limiting, and all of those things are going to help us improve that ratio. But if I just show you a really quick example here of a break that might be perfect for drum and bass, and it definitely has potential, but it's sounding a bit lackluster, and especially because it's really peaky but not very loud. And in order to adapt this break to work with a drum and bass track, we've really got to go and use saturation and compression and things like that to make it louder. And therefore when we go to mix it later on in our track, it's going to be a lot easier, and it's not going to get swallowed up by all the other elements when we try and push it and make the overall track actually sound loud. Now, one final decision you've actually got to make before you start processing your breaks is whether you want to do it as one whole unit or actually chop up the break into all its individual elements and process it that way. And there's actually a few pros and cons to both of these techniques. Processing your break as one whole element is generally a lot quicker and easier and can actually be a more cohesive way of doing it, as everything's just being applied to one audio track. But in return for that, you do lose a little bit of control and it's harder to be more precise and clean up specific problems with the break. On the other hand, if you do decide to go through all the effort of chopping up the break into all its individual elements and then dragging them to all their own audio tracks, this does give you more control over each piece of the break. And in turn, we can be a little bit more precise about how we're processing our break, and maybe we can get slightly cleaner results this way by removing mud and boxiness from specific elements. But the trade-off is it can make the break sound less cohesive, and you can overdo this processing to each of the individual elements and it can ruin the overall vibe of the break. So there's definitely always a balancing act there, and it's not always a better technique. But those are really your two options when you're deciding how to go about processing your breaks. So for my amen here, I actually chose to split it up into all its individual elements, as I knew I was going to want to do some layering and I just wanted that control for later on. And I've got my kick on a bus, my snare on a bus, and then the shuffles on another one. And if I just take you through things step by step here, really with the kick, I've just got the standard amen kick here. And then I've just layered this with just a body style kick. At a really low level, and it's just making the amen kick a little bit more solid. It's so subtle in there. And it's just in the lower area of the kick, I'm just making it a little bit more solid. And for my snare drum here, I think this is worth mentioning. In the actual amen break, there's one snare drum specifically which I think is better than all the other ones, and it's actually in this part of the amen break here. It's this snare here is my favourite one in the amen. If we listen to the whole amen, you can hear this one's just got the best kind of transient and resonance in it, and it's a really wacky snare. So in particular, that one really hits me. So I usually use this snare as the main one I'm going to use when I do my amen break processing. So I've dragged that snare out to its own layer. And then I've gone and layered this up. So this layer is doing... So I'm just trying to give it a bit more whack is the main thing I'm thinking. When I was listening to the Secret Liaison break, I noticed their snare in particular is really wacky. And so lots of the processes I went through here was trying to emphasize that. And so if I listen to the snare with and without these layers, it's maybe sounding a little bit cleaner by itself, but it definitely has a little bit more body and it's a little bit fuller with these layers. And then finally I've got the shuffles down here at the bottom, but one thing I have done with these shuffles is I have actually picked a few different variations of the shuffles from the amen break. So this one here and this one, and then these two are all slightly different shuffles. And if you hear, there's just slightly different tones in the shuffles, and this is because I know I'm going to want to use these different variations later on when I come to actually program my breaks. So I would just go through this actual amen break at the top and find the ones that I like the most out of these shuffles. You can kind of see them. Got one there, another one there, there's another one here, and another one at the end. So you can mix and match these shuffles to try and find the best hits to kind of make this perfect amen break. And then one thing I've also done is clean up a lot of this mud and low kind of boxy stuff here between 200 Hz and 500 Hz. I'm trying to pull away as much as I can get out of these shuffles. So you can hear it sounding a lot cleaner there by pulling away all those unnecessary frequencies in the low end. Now I've actually kept the individual processing on all these elements pretty sparse, and I'm just using EQ mainly on all of these elements to make them fit where I want them in the track. And most of this is just about removing unnecessary low end from the layers that need it. But then I've done a bit more processing kind of up the chain a little bit more on the buses for each of these layers. So the kick drum has got a little bit of saturation happening here in this. This is like the new camel fat in Logic, and just a little bit of EQing as well, kind of shaping this kick a little bit more. So with the kick EQ here, I'm just doing some really standard stuff to try and get a little bit more brightness out of this hit, and also to remove some of this boxy muddy region. Now the snare here, I've put through a little bit more of a rigorous process, and I was really trying to get a wacky snare, and I was always referencing that one in Secret Liaison. So I'll take you through step by step here what I've kind of done. And firstly, I've done a transient shaper just to add a little bit more attack right in the beginning. And then I've come and done some filtering, and what I'm trying to do here is a high pass with a bit of a resonance, and this is boosting in snares. There's often, if I actually show you in an EQ here, there's often this low resonance here, this kind of frequency around 200 Hertz. I think in this break it's coming in at 270, but there's often a low resonance in the snare which has quite a nice knock to it, and it gives the snare a lot of warmth. So I'm trying to emphasize that frequency a little bit, but I'm also putting it through just the analog kind of style or analog algorithm of this filter freak, just to give it a little bit of saturation as well. And then I've done some very light reverb here as well. And this is actually because the snare was sounding a little bit dead and I wanted it to ring out a little bit longer. So I've done a little bit of reverb, which just makes it sound like it doesn't just cut at the end. It just has a little bit more of a natural fade to it. And then a little bit more kind of saturation from this fat effects, and then an EQ doing some more tonal shaping here. It's really making a big difference, and what it's doing is, as well as removing some of this boxy region again and a lot of this unnecessary low, I'm also raising these important resonances in this snare. And you can see these resonances here. There's kind of one at 600 Hertz maybe, and one at 1K that I'm bringing up, and it's really adding a lot of that whack. So you can hear that actually EQ there is really helping me to get a bit more punch and whack out of the snares. And then I've done one more EQ here at the end, just doing a little bit more control of this low end, and then adding a little bit of brightness with this upper band here. One final technique that was really cool and I actually explored for the first time in processing this break is this thing from a Dan Worrell tutorial called parallel bandpass EQing. And what I did was find those resonances in the snare I've been talking about. So I've got two Pro EQs here, and they're both at slightly different things. So this is at 956 Hertz, sorry, and this one's at 587 Hertz. And if you can see, I'm highlighting these two different resonances in the snare. And so I've got these both on sends, and then I can dial in these resonances. And if I just do this one by one, you can really hear it's got that hollow, knocky sound in this resonance. And then if I turn this one off and go to this one, that's got a bit more of a metallic kind of ping sound in it. And I'm obviously really exaggerating how much of it I'm adding there, but it's a really good, another really good way to try and get those snares to really whack is actually to bring up some of the nice resonances in the snare drums. And then with the bus processing on the perks, I've also run them through a filter freak, just cutting off this low end again, and it's just going through this clean saturation analog style emulation from Filter Freak, and with a little bit more kind of saturation things going on there. So I've not done too much processing to the perks, and a lot of it's just been done to the snare. And then finally on the bus, I've got more of that camel fat thing, so I've just been chucking that everywhere. I was really testing out using it on this track. And then I've done a little bit of compression and a little bit of transient shaping, and I don't think this limiter's doing anything, so this limiter's just sitting there. And so if I show you very quickly now just a before and after of the Amen break before I took it through all this process, and then my finished one coming out of Logic here now. So when I was talking about the actual goals I set out right at the beginning of what I'm trying to achieve through this break, I think I've definitely made it more punchy and brighter and just sound bigger and better in almost every way. So I was really happy with this as kind of a first stage of my processing for this break. And then now I'm going to show you a few more things I did in Renoise once I actually chopped up this break and I started programming it in there. Okay, so now we're in Renoise, and I quickly want to take you through a few more things I've actually done with this Amen break processing in here. And one thing I want to say is I actually did all the stuff I did in Logic was before the track even started. And that was really in the sound design stages for me of preparing for this track. And so I've really left off a lot of limiting specifically from that stage, because I know I might want to process the break a little bit more in Renoise here. And so I think a really good place to start is actually to come and look at this one trick I did here, where I've actually sent this snare off to its own effects lane. And on this effects lane, I've applied a little bit of compression here just to make the snare a little bit more wacky. But another thing I did was actually use a really short reverb. And so I've got the reverb on a send here on a really short time, so 0.45 seconds, really small size. And then I'm also low cutting all the low energy out of this reverb. And then I'm also shaping this reverb even more to really fit with the tone I'm trying to get. And all of this stuff is about trying to make that snare as wacky as I can. And I was really trying to emulate the way Source directed it in their track. So if we listen to this snare before and after, it's giving it a bit of room sound and a bit of grit, and that actual reverb is much more tonally adding to the snare, making it maybe a bit more metallic as well than it is putting it in a space. It's making it a bit harsher, but it's definitely giving it a bit more whack. And then if I really quickly just rattle you through all of the extra processing I've done in Renoise, just to give you an overview of the extra steps I've taken in here. I've done a tiny bit of amp with this decimal, just giving it a little bit of that coming out of a sampler feel. And then a little bit of resonances here, just removing some harsh resonances with this Pro Q. So you have pleasant resonances in snares, but also unpleasant ones, so you want to get rid of them. And then this PSP Vintage Warmer, just giving me a little bit of vibe. I've got this, it's kind of a saturation compression plugin. And it's obviously making it sound a little bit more muddy and less clean there, but I was trying to probably bring back some of that room sound in the break and to just give it a little bit more vibe there. And then after saturation, I always talk about it, after saturation is usually good to add a little bit of punch back in that the saturation can take away. So that's why I've added this transient master there. And then finally, more shaping. This is definitely more mixing stuff here. I was trying to remove more of that muddy area in the break as a whole, maybe adding a little bit more low end, and then just little EQ moves here just to try and make it fit better in the break. And then also a soothy, just soothing out the top end of the break. Just makes everything sound a little bit cleaner. It definitely does do a little bit then, and that's the way I'm usually using soothy, is just to pull out some of the resonances in this high frequency area here. The final two things I've got at the end of my chain here are a compressor doing fast attack compression, just softening the transient slightly before it goes into a limiter, and then I'm just doing 1 dB of limiting and a little bit of saturation on this limiter here as well. So I'm just trying to achieve a little bit of loudness at the final stages of this processing chain. And you're also probably thinking, holy smokes, that's such a laborious process to go through to get a good sounding break. And the first thing is, you don't always have to do this much processing to make your break sound good. But what I did do in this track is I really used my ears more than my eyes and more than my brain, and I really incrementally improved this break step by step to try and sound as good as that Source Direct one. And it was a really good kind of workflow for me to go through, because what I was doing is really picking from all of the tools I went through in the last tutorial and just throwing them in there one by one to keep improving this break until I got it to sound the way I wanted. So I think that might be the perfect place to actually finish off this tutorial, and in the next one we're going to be getting into break chopping and programming, and I'm going to be showing you how to get your breaks rolling in the style of Source Direct. So lots of fun stuff coming up. And I also want to say a big thank you to anyone who's been subscribing to my Patreon and supporting me on YouTube. It all means a lot to me, and yeah, I really appreciate it. So I will catch you in a couple of weeks with the next one. Peace.